So to start, to give a little bit of background of the historical Buddha, he was born in a city called Lumbini, which is near the capital called Kapilvatthu, which is still extant, and this is in northern India, which is at the Nepalese and what is now the Nepalese and the Indian border. So you see the Buddha depicted with the inverted eyelids, the typical Mongoloid features, because he was from that region. So if you see people from Nepal, this is what we presume he looked like. He was apparently born into a princely family, a royal family. There were certain auspicious signs about him. His father decided that a fortune teller had said that he would become either a great world monarch or a great spiritual monarch. And so his father, who was a prince of the court there, what is called the Sakyan Republic, and that is why he is called the Sakyamuni Buddha, because he is the sage of the Sakyans. So that's one of his appellations, the Sakyamuni Buddha. He was raised in 3 palaces to keep him out of any kind of worldly life. He had only female attendants, and he somehow was prevented from leaving these 3 palaces, which represented the 3 seasons that the Indians consider seasons. And the legend is that he was able to get out, and he saw a corpse on the streets of Kapilvatthu, so that was his first experience with death. He saw an older person, and that was his first experience with old age. He saw a very sick person, that was his first experience with sickness, because he had been kept in these pleasure domes so that he would not have any experience of the outer world and just become addicted to this kind of luxury. So at that time, he was married, and he had a 2-year-old daughter, and he became very despondent about what he had seen, and he decided to desert the palaces, desert his family, his wife, his child of 2 years of age, and join what is called the samanas, which were the ascetics of the time. And that begins his journey as the Buddha at age, his name was Siddhartha Gautama, that begins his journey towards enlightenment. So between the ages of 29 and 35, 6 years, he's attending to very severe ascetic practices that these wanderers, as they're called, the samanas, adhere to for the purpose of burning out their past karmas, not being reborn into this life of suffering and this life of confusion, to come out of all of what we understand as old age, sickness, death. He pursues a path of the Arhat. The Arhat is a full conqueror, or the victorious one, and the Arhat is one who has overcome death. He is victorious over death. Death can no longer lure that Arhat into his kingdom. The kingdom of death, according to the beliefs of the time, is the kingdom of karmic retribution, and then rebirth, and then rebirth and rebirth. So just to go backwards in time a little bit, what is the context of the Buddha's life? We can go back about 1,500 years before his birth, as I said, 563 before the Common Era, and it is debated by scholars, but that there was an invasion that came out of northern Europe and crossed into Persia and what is now Iran, and into Pakistan, down into what is the Indus River Valley. And that is where the British got the word Hindu. It was from the Indus River that the civilization, which was called Vedic civilization, was conquered by these invaders. So we speak English, which is part of the Indo-European language group. I'm sure you've heard that, the Indo-European language group is English, Swedish, all the Scandinavian languages, Dutch, German, and the variation of the dialects there. So when you study Sanskrit, it's amazing how many Sanskrit words are actually embedded in the English language. Even a common word like you hear yoga, the English word yoke, which means to unify or to join, is derived from yoga, which means union. Does not mean Eastern calisthenics. Okay, but that's where the word yoga and yoke are derived. So that's by the language group. Now as they come into this Indus River civilization already, the 4 castes are set according to the scholars: the Brahmins, who are the priests, the Khatiyas, who are the warriors, the Vasas, who are the merchants, and then the Sudras, who are the working class, basically, the artisans and the farmers and so on. And what has been established is this Vedic religion, which worships Brahma, who is the creator, and various other gods like Varuna and Pajapati, and gods that are no longer being worshipped by what we call Hindus today. In fact, the gods that the Hindus worship today, like Krishna and Ram and Shiva, those are not mentioned at all in the ancient texts, which are called the Vedas. And there are 4 particular Vedas: the Samaveda, Rig Veda, the Athura Veda, and the Upanishads. So what happens during that period is that because the Brahmins have the monopoly on the religion, that if you want to pray to Brahman for the things that people pray to God for, whatever that is, health, finances, children, crops, things that people typically at that point and at this point still worship for, you would have to go through the Brahmins, which means that you would have to bring a sacrifice of some sort. You would have to bring a bull or a horse, or you would have to bring something to pay the Brahmins to intercede for you to Brahman and the other gods. And so the people who could not afford these types of rituals and incantations as they're prescribed in those Rig Vedas, in the Vedas themselves, became more and more dissatisfied. There was a shakeup of the society, and men and women started to just wander out into the jungles, into the forests, in the attempt to somehow communicate with the gods, to burn off past karmas, even to attain supernatural powers, etc. And these became known as the samanas, or the wanderers. And this is the background of what the Buddha is born into, this period where there was a change and shifting of religious views within India. It's also interesting to note historically that that period is the same period that Lao Tzu, Shuangzi, Confucius were living. It's the same period that Socrates and Plato were also living during that period in different parts of the world. It's been called the Axial Age, a time within about a 60 or 80 year period where there were very interesting world thinkers and teachers promulgating their own versions of reality. And so the Buddha goes through many of these ascetic practices, which are to burn off past actions and purify oneself in body and mind. And these were very severe tortures that are described that the Buddha himself endured in his quest to conquer death. Right? So eating 1 sesame seed a day, or eating 1 bean a week, or eating calves dung, or ritual of what is called the 5 fires, where in the noon heat of the Indian summer, they would have 4 fires, and the 5th fire was the sun, and they would just sit in the middle of these 4 or 5 fires. Again, purification rites. There were ascetics who were called the dog ascetics, and they just went on their hands and knees and urinated and just ate with their mouths and whatever they could find on the. So these, in that quest for spiritual purity. So this is the milieu. And so the Buddha is now partaking in these various ascetic practices with different groups and he is sitting, doing some of these practices at the Narayana River in northern India, and he has a kind of realization is, why am I doing all this ascetic practice? And I have had no realizations, I have had no change actually in my psyche, no change whatsoever. And why am I afraid of things that are pleasurable even, and why am I just torturing myself? He said at the time my eyes were black, all the hair of my head and my beard, which was part of the practice, was pulling out one hair of your head hair and one hair of your beard hair at the time as part of this ascetic practices. And he said the skin at the front of my stomach was sticking to the ribs of my back. He was probably in a very bad physical condition at the time, but he had this realization, why am I torturing myself? And he remembered a time when he was an infant and he was part of his father. There was a ritual, a spring ritual, where they took him out to the field and he was left alone, and he had some kind of ecstatic experience. And so he remembered that. At that point, a young girl, a goat herd, appeared and offered him some porridge, that is a rice porridge, and he partook of that. He was with 5 other friends doing these rituals, these ascetic practices, and these other 5 friends said, well, Gautama has gone over to the life of luxury. He has given up on the quest by taking this little porridge. And they deserted him, and it was on that night that he had his night of enlightenment. And that was the night where he saw all his past lifetimes. And at this point, my name was such and such. These were my parents. I belonged to this clan. At this time, my name was such and such. These were my parents. I belonged to this clan. He understood the whole scheme of karma, why some people are ugly, why some people are beautiful, why some people are sick, why some people are healthy. So he had this special night of enlightenment. It's interesting to note at that time in the discourses that he also explains that Mara visited him. Now Mara is death itself, and death appears in various times in the Chronicles, much like we hear that the devil, quote, or Shaitan, Satan, appears to Jesus, and the temptations even with Moses and so on. So death is there to tempt him, saying, well, now you know everything there is to know. You know, you have conquered the world now. Why don't you come and join me in my kingdom? And we can rule all the worlds together. And Buddha says, no, I know who you are, and I'm stronger than you. I have conquered you. So Mara continues to tempt him with these blandishments throughout his life. Touching on the name Buddha. Okay, Buddha means to know, right? A Buddha is one who knows. He reputedly sat under the Bodhi tree for about six weeks after that night of enlightenment. That is the tree of knowledge. So this is not necessarily information. It's a knowledge of reality as it is at the deepest level. So when we are talking about the Dharma, which are the teachings, that's one of the definitions of Dharma, which comes from the Sanskrit verb dara, which means to hold. So the Dharma is that which holds everything. And he was able to apprehend the Dharma. And so one of the phrases that's famous of his is yata bhuta jana dasana, meaning to know and see things as they are. To become a knower means to experience what is called the jnanas. Okay, and there are 8 jnanas, which are the absorption into knowledge. So, most of us, we know things like from an object, there's a knower, and there's an object that we know. Jnana, the root word is ja, which means to come close to. So the more you come close to something, right, the more you would know that thing. If you were completely absorbed into that thing, you would have the ultimate knowledge because you would be that thing. So the pursuit of the jnanas, the 8 jnanas, which I'll go into a little bit later, that is the knowledge of things, to become a Buddha, a knower at the deepest level, in knowing not just what the senses apprehend, but that which we can't see as well. And there's most of what the astrophysicists have told us is 85% of the universe, they don't even know what it is. They just call it dark energy. 10% they call dark matter. 5% is just matter. So 85%. So to know things as they are at the deepest level. By explication, what the name Buddha, what it really means is one who knows. And if you've traveled to India, you will see Babas, you will see Gurus, you will see Bhagavans, you will meet these Shri so-and-so, but no one, you may even meet someone who calls himself an avatar, but you will never meet someone who calls himself a Buddha. If you declare yourself to be a Buddha, you're going to be rushed. And that he was rushed when he declared himself to be the Buddha, the Tathagata, as he called himself, the one who has come from thus come. Then, surely, all of these religious sects and these communities, these sanghas, came on to him to test him, saying, really, you're a Buddha? We have never met a Buddha. You declare yourself to be the Buddha? And not only the other sects, the other ascetics and the other leaders of other sects came to debate with him and interrogate him, but kings came to him, the queens came to him, the courtesans came to him, the wealthy merchants came to him, students came to him, the Brahmins came to debate and to interrogate this guy. You're the Buddha? Okay, well, let me ask you about this. And as you read these dialogues and these dialectics that he explicates in these, which I'll try to touch on a little bit. I can only give a very rough outline of what we're talking about here. It is really magnificent how the brilliance of this particular individual and his whole completely radical take on things that made him pretty much the most famous person in all of India at that time. Because no one could not only out-debate him, but out-reason him in that sense. For instance, there is, I'll touch on this earlier, a little bit later too, what is called the Brahmajala Sutta, which means the supreme net, the discourse on the supreme net. And in that discourse, in 62 arguments, he destroys soul theory. Okay, now soul theory is very important to people, right? Even though in the Old Testament or the New Testament, there's never a mention of the soul. Okay, but this has become a very interesting subject to us about the soul. And in that particular discourse, he destroys soul theory in 62 different arguments, which when you read them, they're just mind-boggling how logical it really is. And I'll try to touch on that in a moment too. So that, by way, is just setting up a little bit about the background of who this individual was. There's water there, by the way, if you want a little bit more water. So let me start on the teachings. That's a little bit about the background of the Buddha himself. It's very difficult, to know where to actually start. Even these collections don't start in any logical way. They're just collected because these are the long discourses. Nobody knows when he spoke those long discourses. These are the medium-length discourses. Nobody knows when he spoke those. Shorter discourses, connected discourses, etc. So really, where does one start? And I really, to try to teach it, what I said is a 15-week 3-unit course, we could expand a lot more. But to try to, in a cogent way, which is what is really needed to get into this genius, to try to reduce it to 90 minutes is quite a challenge. So what I will say is that we can start with what is called the tilaksanas, which are the 3 marks of existence. And from each of those, we can create thought tributaries as well. The first tilaksana the Buddha talks about is anicca. Anicca means impermanence. And he continues to repeat anicca, anicca, anicca. All is impermanent. All is impermanent. Now this is rather obvious. You don't have to be a great intellectual or a college graduate to understand that everything is impermanent. But this is the first mark of existence. And I don't know if you know Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk. He's very famous. And there's a guy named Ram Dass, who's an American guru that you might be familiar with as well. I saw an interview between them, and Ram Dass was talking about anicca with Thich Nhat Hanh, and he said, why do you think it's so hard for people to understand this concept of impermanence? And Thich Nhat Hanh said, it's not hard for them to understand it. It's hard for them to act as if they understand it. So saying that all feelings, pleasant or unpleasant, are subject to arising and passing away. All mental states subject to arising and passing away. All things in the mind, that is thoughts, ideas, feelings, emotions, thoughts, judgments, criticisms, analysis, comments, opinions, memories, futurizing things in the future, anxieties, hopes, fears, all things in the mind subject to arising, passing away. All sensations in the body, on the body, through the senses, subject to arising and passing away. And to maintain that awareness that everything is subject to passing away. I know you're going through a grief experience, Bruce. So this understanding and acting as if one understood this aspect of arising and passing away. And the last words of the Buddha, the last recorded words of the Buddha is Vayudama Sankhara, which means all compounded formations are subject to dissolution. Everything impermanent, subject to dissolution. Okay, so this is a very important first concept, the teaching of impermanence. And when we get into the Four Noble Truths, we'll come back to how he further explicates this first mark of existence, impermanence. And then we go into what is called the second mark of existence, and this is called anatta, Anatta means basically no individual, or no I, or the not self. Now this was a very, very radical teaching at that time, because the Hindus, that is the Vedics, believe that there is an Atman, which is basically the soul. Okay, there is the Atman, and then there is the Brahman, and the Atman and the Brahman create a yoga, and in the creation of that yoga, then we find liberation from past lives and future lives, etc. So now here comes the Buddha, a teacher, saying that there is no Atman, there is no soul. And as I said in the Brahmajala Sutta, he's debating, and no one can find this soul. The anatta means no self. So, for instance, the Buddha asks, is the soul eternal? Is the soul not eternal? Is the soul both eternal and not eternal? Is the soul neither eternal nor not eternal? Is the soul infinite, or is the soul finite? Is the soul both finite and infinite, or is the soul neither finite nor not infinite? Does the soul exist after death? Does the soul both exist and not exist after death? So he's asking these kinds of very cogent questions. Have you ever seen the soul? Has your teacher ever seen the soul? Have 7 generations of your teacher ever seen the soul? So and there are these different views. The eternalist view that there is a soul, the soul is eternal. There are the semi-eternalists that believe it is not eternal. It just lives, the soul lives a certain. There are the nihilists who believe there is no soul. Okay, and there are the fortuitous originists who say it's all chance. There may be a soul, there may not be a soul. There are the eel wrigglers. These are the different points of view on, is there a soul or is there not a soul? Okay, and someone else, modern, I don't remember who, said the soul is actually the last outpost of the ego. Now here comes the Buddha destroying this whole, what I truly am at the deepest level, what I am at the soul level. Now I was at the Kumbh Mela in year 2000 in Allahabad, and this is every 12 years, there is this auspicious, according to Hindu astrology, there's a time when there's a certain alignment, and if you go to this place where the Ganga River and the Yamuna and the Varna River meet, this huge place, and 10 million people descend on this place for about 2 weeks, then you will have good fortune and you may escape rebirth and so on, all this kind of superstition. So I happened to be there at that time, and I went there, and the Dalai Lama flew in, and the Bollywood stars flew in, and Richard Gere and Julie Roberts, they all, descend on this kind of spiritual Woodstock of 10 million people with no toilets, by the way. It's a very nasty scene. I don't recommend you go, or if you go for a day trip. But I saw a film of it. It's just massive. Later I saw a documentary, and when the Dalai Lama comes to speak, he says, my brothers, there's like millions of people there, literally. This is India. And he says, my brothers, we are all brothers. You, my Hindu brothers, you believe in Atman. We Buddhists, we do not believe in Atman, but we are all brothers, my brothers. And so this is a very important point, this point of anatta. Now, what is then this you and me? What is this? So the Buddha goes further. He says, well, there is this so-called self. There is a so-called self. All right? And what are the 5 aggregates, what are called the Panchaskandhas, the 5 aggregates of this so-called self? All right? There is the physical form of the self, and that, he says, is made up of the 4 great elements, that is the earth element, water element, fire element, air element, and we it's figurative what is hard in the body, like the bones can be considered earth element, all the liquid, 70% of our body could be considered the water element, the fire element is all the acids, the body is 98 degrees hot inside as well, and the air element, of course, what we're breathing and releasing. And so that is what is called the form aggregate. That is what he says is one of the 5 parts or aggregates of the so-called self. But he's very derisive about this so-called self. He says the self is actually as insubstantial as a bubble on the foam of a wave out at sea. That's how insubstantial this so-called self is, subject to impermanence, of course, subject to anatta, that is at the deepest, when you're talking about particle physics, the particle physicists who cannot find, they think they found the Boson-Higgins particle, the God particle, but they cannot, everything is subdividing, and so the Buddha is prescient, he's like almost one of these astrophysicists, 2,600 years ago, saying there is no individuated solid self. Now, if you know where the word atom comes from, it's a Greek word which means non-divisible. So they thought they had found these particles that were no longer divisible. What we know today, there's no end to this divisibility. So now he's breaking it up as to the form aggregate. Then there is what is called the feeling aggregates, okay? Then we have pleasant feelings or unpleasant feelings. We have pleasant feelings in the body or unpleasant feelings in the body. We have pleasant feelings on the body, pleasant visual or unpleasant visual. These are called all subject to arising, passing away, arising, passing away. Back to the form aspect, the first aspect we talked about. The Buddha says not only is it so insubstantial, this form, as we know, however long it lasts, in whatever condition it lasts. He said, monks, this is the way that you should think about the form, the 4 great elements of this form aggregate. For instance, if you were to be walking on the highway, begging, which is what they did, and a brigand, that is a highwayman or a robber, a group of robbers attack you, and they have these wooden clubs, and they start beating you over the head with the wooden club, you should be thinking to yourself, this is earth element meeting earth element. And if you're able to be in a state where you can actually grok that, I don't know what the word is, know that earth element is meeting earth element, you would not get angry, you would not get fearful, and you would understand my teaching. In the same way, if these brigands took you and threw you into the water and tried to drown you, you would understand water element is meeting water element. And if they threw you off a cliff, air element is meeting air element. If they threw you in the fire, fire element meeting fire element. I don't know if you remember, but in the Vietnam War, before the war was full-fledged, some of these Vietnamese monks practiced self-immolation. And the first monk who did it, it's fascinating. I mean, it's horrible, but they have it all filmed of this guy. They douse him with the gasoline, then they light him, and he's just sitting there. He's just sitting there burning, and then he just falls over. He doesn't move. Now you and I could not do that. So you have to ask yourself, how does one do that? But if you understand this part of the teaching, and this is the complexity of this type of teaching, and is it possible and is it not possible? We're not here to speculate right now. We're just going to go through the teachings and decide whether they're valid or not, or could be true or could not be true. So we discussed the form, physical form, the sensations, pleasant or unpleasant sensations, arising to passing away, an impermanence, and then there is the perception aggregate. The perception aggregate is basically how we label what we perceive. All right, so we have many labels, obviously. We have Democrats, we have Republicans, we have Chinese people, we have Jewish people, we have Africans, we have different types of dogs. And so we are labeling, we are perceiving our experience. And this is the perception group, what he calls the perception group. And of course, these perceptions subject to arising, passing away, and subject to anatta, the dissolution of those perceptions as well. And then there is what is called the consciousness group, all right? And the consciousness group basically relates to the sixth sense bases, how we are conscious of things, okay? Visual consciousness, audio consciousness, sapid, olfactory, and the skin, the touch, and then there is the mental, is how we perceive things too. Is how we are conscious of things from a mental perspective. Oh, this is an interesting talk. This is not an interesting talk. This is an interesting argument, or this is a good argument. This is not a good argument. These are on the mental side, is how we're perceiving in the same way, and through these conscious organs, these six conscious organs, which is the mind, is the sixth one. And then there is what is called the formations, the sankharas, which is what he mentions in his last words, Vayudama Sankhara. These are the formations, and he was pre-Freudian. He was pre-Jungian. He said that we are born with all these downloaded programs. We are downloaded with algorithms and predilections and preconditioned kinds of responses. And these are already formed in us in many different ways. Jung said it was the collective unconscious. Freud was more into the societal norms and so on, so on. So you can see on that level, the Buddha was already thinking, but not expressing in the same way. This is what is called the five aggregates, which are the so-called self. And again, anatta means the dissolution or the non-intrinsic reality. Think about it. Does a thought have a weight, a measurement? Does a sound have a weight or measurement? There is so much that we cannot individuate in that way and barely measure. So this is the anatta, which then moves into the disputation of the soul. Okay, so if there is no substantiality to this so-called self, there is no substantiality to this concept of the soul. And then he goes into what is called shunyata. Now shunyata is defined as emptiness or void, and these are parts of the reasons why Western theologians really despise the Buddha, because they say his teachings are nihilistic. There is no self, there is no soul, there's only this emptiness, but it's not emptiness in a hermetic sense where there's nothing going on. This is the emptiness of removing oneself from conscious objects. So he gives the example. There's a monk, and he's wandering in the town, and he's begging. Now the monk retires to the forest. So now the monk has emptied himself, shunyata meaning emptiness. So he's practicing empty. He has emptied himself of the village. Now he's sitting in the forest, and he's piled up some leaves and dirt so he can sit in meditation. Now he goes into meditation. He empties himself of the forest. Now he's sitting there for some time meditating. Now he's emptying himself of the earth itself. Now he's going further, deeper into his meditation. He's emptying himself of the observer of the emptying. So it gets more and more subtle and more abstract in that way. I personally have not experienced those states, but they're described very vividly. And there are people who can describe some of those experiences in going through what is called shunyata, or emptiness, which is part of the second mark of existence, anatta. Then we go into the third mark of existence. I'm watching the clock here, okay. Which is called dukkha. Now, dukkha means suffering or unease or dissatisfactoriness, but it's mainly been defined as suffering. And this is where people consider his magnum opus lies in what he calls the Four Noble Truths. Because remember, he is trying to be a death conqueror. He is trying to get away from death, illness, old age, and also he mentions birth, because there's suffering in birth. Probably don't remember, but 150 years ago, moms and children mortality and infant mortality rates was 50%. It was just, that's it, 50% of children died, 50%. And the Buddha's own mother died after 7 days after she gave birth, and he was raised by his aunt. Oh, by the way, he does go back, just biographically, he does go back to Kapilavatthu after his enlightenment to visit his father and to visit his aunt who raised him, and to visit his son, who's now 7 or 8 years old, whatever it is, and the wife, who at the time he left her, I think she was 16. And they hear his teachings, and they become converted, and they enter into the order themselves. His aunt becomes actually the first woman, and she creates the order of the nuns, okay, and her would be called daughter-in-law, his ex-wife, and the son follows into the male order of the whole sangha. And so this idea of suffering and getting away from suffering, and this does not mean temporary happiness or pleasures, which are all subject to, again, impermanence and to dissolution or anatta. So what the Four Noble Truths? The first noble truth is that there is suffering. And what is suffering? Suffering is birth, suffering is old age, suffering is illness, suffering is death, suffering is not getting what you want, suffering is getting what you don't want, suffering is being with people you don't love, suffering is not being with people you do love. Suffering is attachment to the pleasures related to the so-called self and the five aggregates, which are impermanent and subject to dissolution. So he describes, as a doctor would, this is the disease suffering, okay, and these are the attributes of your disease, which is suffering. And then as a doctor, you might ask him, well, how did I get this? So that's the second noble truth, is the origins of suffering. And in short, he says the origin of suffering is desire, okay, or craving, desire for things that are impermanent and subject to dissolution. So whatever that is, if it's related to the body, pleasant sensations in the body, pleasant sensations on the body. And the opposite of suffering, the opposite of desire is aversion. So not only desiring, clinging on to things that we desire that are impermanent, subject to dissolution, but also clinging on to things that we don't like, okay? And that we want to avert, but we're holding on to those, but those are subject to arising, passing away, subject to dissolution. So suffering is desire for things that are impermanent and subject to dissolution. All right, so that describes the origin of suffering, which is the disease. right? And then the doctor will say, well, there is a prescription here, okay, that I can give you. And the prescription is called the noble truth of the cessation of suffering. And the cessation of suffering is the giving up of desires or aversions, giving up of desire or aversions for things that are impermanent and things that are subject to dissolution. That is the cure, the prescription to ending suffering. But then the fourth noble truth, which is the path to the cessation of suffering. Okay, now he's going to tell you as a doctor, he was called the great physician in that way. Now he's going to tell you, okay, you want to get out of suffering, okay, this is what you have to do now. This is your what's it called, a prescription, to wellness, or to come out of suffering. And so there, the path to the cessation of suffering is comprised of the eightfold noble path, the eightfold path as it's called. The first step in the eightfold path is called right view. Okay, and right view means that one understands there is karma. Okay, karma means actions, and that there is what is called vipaka phala, which means the resultant fruits of action. So really, to use the term, people go, oh, he got his karma. The police saw him with that illegal turn or whatever, he got his karma. He got the results of his actions. Okay? So the first right view is that there are consequences, there is karma, and the cogent phrase that he uses, kamasaka. One's karma are one's only belongings. One's karma are one's only belongings. And then he goes further. One's karmas are one's birth. One's karmas are one's parents. One's karmas are one's heritage. One's karmas are one's destiny. One's karmas are one's refuge. And so this is what is called right view. Just so you understand, we understand that there is action and there is resultant fruits of actions and what those can be. And this idea of karma is a whole nother talk in itself that I've also done. There's a talk on the disputation of the soul as well that I've done. So these are all individual long talks on their own, but one in the short version, understanding right view means that there is karma resultant fruits of one's actions. And remember that there are three types of karmas, basically. There's mental karmas, how we think about things, good thoughts, or wholesome thoughts, unwholesome thoughts, as they call them, not good or bad. Wholesome, unwholesome thoughts is the phrase that he uses. There's verbal actions and there's physical actions. So one understands that there's going to be resultant fruit and they will bear more karmas, basically, coming at you, more formations, sankharas coming at you. So what is the second step is in the Eightfold Path to the cessation of suffering is right intention or right thought. And in short, what he says is right intention or right thought is the giving up of ill will and ahimsa, which is giving up of violence, basically, not peace. And if you think about it, if people were to give up ill will, thinking bad thoughts or saying bad, unwholesome things, not bad, he uses, as I said, the word wholesome, unwholesome, and if people were to give up violence, this world would be a whole different type of world. So that is the second step, is the intention or the thought of giving up ill will and violence. Then we go to the third step, which is called right speech. He says right speech is abstaining from divisive speech, abstaining from false speech, abstaining from harsh speech, and abstaining from babble or inconsequential speech. All right, so he says if you're an Aryan, that is a noble one, this is where, you know, Hitler and so on, they took that phrase, the Aryans. Aryan means literally the noble ones. So the noble ones, he says, if you can't speak about the Dharma, that is the teachings, then just maintain noble silence. Right? So you don't get into any of those four areas. And in the longer discourses, the Nikaya Suttas, then there's about 3 or 4 pages. It's fascinating. He says, don't talk about the theater, don't talk about the circus, don't talk about the performers, don't talk about the kings, don't talk about the queens, don't talk about the war, don't talk about the food, don't talk about, you know, he gives a whole list of things that he considers to be babble, or divisive, or harsh, or false. And this is part of the first 5 precepts in the Vinaya, in the rules of the order. The first 5 rules, which are of the 250 rules, the first rule is abstain from killing. So if you become a monk or a nun, you have to take the vow that you will abstain from killing, you will abstain from taking what is not given, you will abstain from sexual misconduct, you will abstain from divisive speech, false speech, harsh speech, babble, and you abstain from intoxicants. So he encouraged the lay people, his lay followers, if you can't follow the 250 rules of the order, okay, then at least try to follow the first 5 rules of the order. So that relates to the third. The fourth is right action, okay, and this is again karma, meaning right speech, which we just went through, right mental action, and right physical action. So right mental and right physical action relates to wholesome actions, okay, which means you abstain from unwholesome actions, which are basically hatred, greed, and delusion. Hatred is an extreme of ill will. You could think ill will of someone, but hatred goes even further than ill will. Greed is desire, but intense, crazy levels of desire. And delusion is not seeing things as they are, not being a Buddha, not knowing things as they are at the deepest level, which encompasses these teachings, as we were saying, impermanence, anatta, and the Four Noble Path, the Four Noble Truths. So it's also interesting to ask, well, what does he mean by abstain from sexual misconduct? Right? That's an action, that's a physical action, or a mental action, or it could be a verbal action too. It means that one will not have sex with someone who's under the guardianship of another. Okay, so that would mean the wife, someone else's wife, she's under the guardianship of the husband and the husband's family, not having sex with a child who's under the guardianship of another, and as gross as it is, not having sex with animals who are under the guardianship of another. 2,600 years, people were doing the same crazy things we're doing today. So in that sense, one understands sexual misconduct is not having sex with someone who's under the guardianship of another. Intoxicants, to abstain from intoxicants, etc. So that is right action, and then we go into right livelihood. Okay, so right livelihood means that you would be following the first 5 precepts. So in other words, you're following abstain from violence, so you'd not be a murderer, you'd not be a soldier, you'd not be a butcher. Anything that involves killing, you would abstain from that being your livelihood. Okay, and then abstain from taking what is not given, so you would not be a robber, right? You would not be a scammer or whatever people do to steal. Abstain from sexual misconduct, so you would not be a pimp or pornographer or somebody like that. sex trafficker, etc. Abstain from harsh speech, divisive speech, false speech. You know, this, I say this as a joke, you might not be a politician, you know, you might, so whoever engages in that kind of speech, you know, that is not considered wholesome.
Can't think of anything.
And then abstain from intoxicant livelihood, meaning that you would not be a purveyor of liquor or a purveyor of marijuana, fentanyl, etc. You would not purvey that. And so then we go into right effort. Okay, and right effort means, I hope you understand, this is how complex and layered and logical and precise this guy is. He's an Einsteinian in that on this kind of a social, emotional, personal, universal level. Right effort means you make the effort to suppress unarisen, unwholesome action. You make the effort to suppress unarisen, unwholesome actions. So we all have unarisen, unwholesome actions within us, and the right effort would be to suppress those, and then to suppress or stop. Right effort to stop already arisen, unwholesome actions. Okay, and remember that is extreme is hatred, greed, delusion, or any forms on that spectrum of whatever hatred is, dislike, etc. And then right effort is to encourage wholesome actions that have not yet arisen, and to maintain wholesome actions that have already arisen. So that is that would be the sixth step on the Eightfold Path. Then we get into right meditation, and I did not have a chance to print out for you, but there is the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, and that is the best instructions on meditation that have ever been spoken. They're 10 pages long, and if you come to one of my yoga classes, we'll review this, but proper meditation begins with the foundation of Anapana, which is the in and out breathing, and then you are developing awareness. Meditation is basically the practice of awareness. You practice awareness of the physical sensations, external, internal physical sensations, and you develop an awareness of the states of the mind, and you develop an awareness of the things in the mind. So it's this, I've said it in a very, very, very brief way, but this is what is called right meditation, okay, which is this expansion of awareness, of knowing things as they are within oneself. Okay, and then we go into the eighth, which is called right concentration, and I'm sorry to tell you, but that is divided up into 8 parts as well. Okay, so Bruce, this is back to law school, you know. So what are
harder than law school?
What are well, the theory is not that hard, but the practice is what is hard. He's just laying out what is called the pariyatti, which is the theory. Okay, the paripatti is the actual practice. And I myself have practiced this very strenuous type of disciplined meditation, not asceticism, because he gave up his asceticism basically with that little bowl of porridge, and he developed what he called the middle way between asceticism and pleasure, that there would be a middle way, but you don't do one or the other too much. But if you take a Vipassana course, it's a 10-day course, and they feed you, they house you, and they give you a place to meditate and instructions on meditation, and that's all you do all day, with breaks in between for breakfast and lunch. Your breakfast is at 6:30 in the morning, and your dinner is at 11:30 in the morning, and then from that time to 6:30 you don't eat. But you have these meditation sessions, and you have instruction. There's silence. They tell you for these 10 days, bring enough clothing. There's no washing of clothing. There's no distraction. You're not supposed to speak with anyone. Of course, no phones, no computers, no reading material, no writing material. So one can do the practice, okay, but it helps to know the theory. And our own teacher, meditation teacher, Mr. Blanca, said you can meditate for 20 years, but if you don't know the theory, it's not going to help you. If you know the theory, but you don't meditate, it won't help you either. So tonight, of course, we're only talking about the theory. So just to, we still have a few more minutes. The 8 yanas, as they're called, the 8 absorptions, as they're called, which is the Eightfold Path, finally to the state of nirvana, which is the state of liberation, or actually, in literal terms, nirvana means not to blow. And when I say that, people hear that nirvana means not to blow. What does that mean? It comes from a verb, not to blow, which means nirva. It is a state where one is no longer blowing on the embers or the fires of desire. So it means not to blow anymore, to cool oneself down. In the fire sermon, which is another famous sutta, he says, monks, your eyes are on fire, your tongues are on fire, your ears are on fire, your skin is on fire. So we are on fire. Passion and desire and this. And so nirvana is a cooling down of that, with the understanding of the 3 laksanas. That is, again, impermanence, anatta, no self, and suffering. And so the eightfold, then that is now the 8 yanas, which remember I said as you get closer to something, you become absorbed in it. The first yana, as you move from meditation, once you develop an awareness, complete awareness without what he calls theme making or discursive thoughts or anything like that, you move into the first yana. And by the way, just another side, a linguistic aside, yana, when after the Buddha's death, the Chinese pilgrims started coming to learn his teachings, and they couldn't say jhana, they couldn't say it the right way, and so jhana became Chen, and then when it moved to Japan, it became Zen. But it's from the word jnana, which is written J-H-A-N-A in English, is how it's written. So the first jhana is the jhana of applied and sustained thought. So we've all experienced this, where you're focused on something and you're sustained on it, and you're so sometimes they, like in the Zen traditional, they give you a koan, which is a certain kind of a mind-boggling shaggy dog joke in a way, and you're supposed to take that and apply your thought and stay concentrated. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Who were you before you were your mother and father? Does a dog have Buddha nature? They give you these sort of silly, what they call koans, to take into that sustained and applied thought, first jhana. Then, once you move, you develop that kind of strength, you move into what is called the concentration jhana. Now you have unwavering concentration on anything you want. It could be your breath, which is what the Buddha prescribes, but he also describes 40 objects of concentration, where your mind is no longer wavers at all. Your mind can just be completely still and in a state of concentration. So then, once you have achieved that, you have to give that up. You have to understand that each one of these jhanas is in fact temporary and subject to dissolution. So if you cling on to one of those, you may have developed some sort of powers of concentration, some sort of powers as we go on, as I describe it. But the idea is you must give that up and move into the third concentration, which is called the ecstatic concentration, that of great joy, ecstasy, what they call realization, people call that, and I've never experienced it, but people go into these ecstatic mystical states, all right? and that's a very joyful state. But you've got to give that up too. You've got to release that, detach yourself from that. Otherwise, you're subject to clinging, and you're subject to craving, and you're subject to staying where you are, and then coming back into the cycle of samsara, rebirth that is in wandering. So you give up even that ecstatic state. You go into the fourth jhana, and that fourth jhana is ecstasy, joy, but with equanimity. So now you're experiencing all of this, but you're not being carried away from it. You're remaining in a calm state throughout that. And then you have to give up that state. And then you move into what is called the four formless jhanas, meaning that you're moving out of the body itself now. And so you come to the fifth jhana, and that is what is called the base of infinite space, the base of infinite space. Now, there is no more difference between you and space. And they say that one could go to the moon, touch the moon, and travel around, astral travel. There is no more restriction for you in this aspect of what we call space. You wouldn't be subject necessarily to the laws of gravity, etc. So again, I've never experienced it, and I don't know people who've experienced it, but in the literature, you will read about people who've had these experiences. But now you have to give that one up as well, and you cannot cling to these because you will still be subject to birth and rebirth, which is moving through the domain of Mara and death. So you don't want to move through that kingdom of death and then have to be reborn. Imagine, I don't know, maybe you do, but if you want to be reborn as an infant, as a toddler, and go through everything that we've gone to come through to this, okay, but most people, would rather not go through all of this again. So then you go into what is called the third of the formless states, and that is what is called the base of. Did I mention I didn't mention. I mentioned the fourth. Okay, the fifth, right, is the basis of no thingness. In other words, now nothing is solid for you anymore. Okay, that means that you could theoretically, or if you've achieved it, you could walk through the wall, you could dive into the earth. There would be nothing that you could not penetrate because you have got this actualization of the fact that all is particles, all is just non-solid, non-intrinsic. Shall we go on or wait?
There's no bathroom.
No bathroom.
There is an alley.
But there's not 10 million people.
There's nothingness bathroom.
So number 6 of the yamas was base of no thingness.
Yes, so now you must give up that base of no thingness. Now you are attaining what is called the cities, or the powers, psychic powers that are beyond the physical realm. All right, and then you go into the seventh jhana, and that is the jhana of infinite consciousness. It means now that there is nothing that you cannot know. You are coming to a Buddha state now, the state of knowing things. Maybe I can look through you and I can hear your thoughts or know everything about you in that way. There is no limit to knowledge or consciousness of any kind, that is hearing consciousness, seeing consciousness, etc. You must give that one up, as pleasant and as interesting and as seductive as that jhana would be. And then you come into the eighth jhana, the final jhana, which is called the state of neither perception nor not perception. It's called the state of neither perception nor not perception. Now you've come to such a fine and subtle state that there is no more distance between you and anything. All right? So there's just a sliver of what we may call the individuated self at that point. Okay, Etan or Bruce or Patricia, there's just a sliver of that so-called self. And there's no more attachment to it. There's just a tiny bit left. And then when you're able to release yourself from that state, again, giving up that state as you did the other states, then you enter into the state of nirvana, which is called the conditionless state. Okay? The state where none of these conditions exist anymore. Now, what happens, if you read the varieties of religious experience, people just pass out for days or weeks or months and no one can find them. They're just gone somewhere. Doesn't sound like a pleasant experience necessarily, but one then understands impermanence, but in an experiential way. One understands dissolution, anatta, one understands suffering, cause of suffering, the path to the cessation of suffering. And that is when one becomes an arhat, a victorious one who has conquered death, no longer subject to birth and rebirth, as you would be even if you had achieved a high state of jnana, 6th, 7th, 8th state of jnana, you would still be subject to some karmic birth and rebirth. So that is a short version of this. And I know it's a lot to grasp, but so hopefully you have a little better understanding of what the Buddha taught. And he didn't say build great statues and don't burn incense in front of those statues. In fact, he said, they asked him, what should we do with your remains after we cremate you and the ashes and the fragments, what should we do? He said, bury them where no one can find them. The only thing that you should worship is the Dharma, is the teachings, the laws that I have explicated is the only thing. But of course, people being people, they need physical representation, the golden calf. They need these physical representations or great Vatican cities and so on and so on. So by way of short introduction, this is the Quran, not that size matters, and this is the Holy Bible, the New Testament and the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, of course, as I said, for the Buddha being a knower, knowledge is everything. For the Judeo-Christian, the Muslim, remember what was original sin? We ate from the tree of knowledge that God had forbidden us to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? And if you read Bereshit, as it's called in Hebrew, if you read Genesis, okay, then when supposedly Shaitan, Satan, in the form of the snake, the serpent is saying, well, do you know, he's telling Eve, do you know why God doesn't want you to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge? And he says the reason is because then you will become like unto him. You will become a God like unto him. And so there's many ways to interpret that, obviously, but that is the reason why we got kicked out of paradise, because she, he, both of them, they wanted to eat from the tree of knowledge, and God forbid them to eat from the tree of knowledge, whereas everything in the teachings of the Buddha is about knowledge at the deepest levels. And like I said, particle physics, collective unconscious, all of that. So if you want to ask a couple of questions, or we'll just break it up. Yeah.
Did the Brahmins, they went to the Brahmins to pray for them?
Yes.
So they would bring the horse, the pig, whatever.
Yeah, they'd have to bring a sacrifice or bales of hay or whatever they had to bring as payment. And then these the Vedas, which were the books that are still extant today, they were the incantations and how to do the fire and how to pour the oil and the various incantations to the gods. So yes, and that was where the dissatisfaction, along with the invasion by these Aryans, happened, was this whole breakup of the society, including the religious norms.
I have another question if nobody else does.
Okay.
How did it get to be so that there's now so many sects of Buddhism?
Well, yeah, because right away there was, when he died, within the first 30 days of the time he died, the 500 arhats that were realized senior monks, and there was a female order, but still it was very patriarchal. They got together in a convocation, which is called the First Council, and Ananda, who was Buddha's first cousin and his personal attendant of the last 25 years, he had a phenomenal memory, and he had a deal with the Buddha. Everything that you say, I'm allowed to memorize and repeat, and things that I have not heard you say, you will tell me, and I will memorize. In those days, everything was mnemonic, because there was no writing materials, there's no Sanskrit alphabet. Everything was memorized. That's why when you read this, there's a lot of repetition, and the numbers of things are laid out in such a way that they can be memorized. And even, I would say, genetically, if you think about the Indians and the tech and all of that, and that kind of maniacal, granular thinking maybe derives from the fact that writing came about 200 years after the Buddha's death. So how the other sects started was after about, that was the first convocation, then after about a year, certain schisms started to happen. Well, the Buddha said, don't accept gold or silver. Don't accept anything in store, because the monks have no possessions. Your only possession is your robe, your bowl, and that's it, basically. And a tree, which is your lodging, and your medicine would be cow dung, And so people wanted to give them gold, and people wanted to give them rice, and he said, you're not to accept anything. All right, now, some of the monks said, well, people are giving us rice. Why shouldn't we take the rice? They're giving us some money. Why shouldn't we take the money? And so that became a schism, and then there became theoretical schisms. It's interesting to note that Tibetan Buddhism, which is, people know Tibetan Buddhism today, actually started 11 centuries after the Buddha's death. Okay? So, and that is a combination of the Bon religion, and they had their own philosophical tributaries and so on. So yes, there are these different sects, just like there are different Christian sects, there are different Jewish sects, different Muslim sects today too. But the original teachers had a particular way, and that was supposed to be the teaching. That's a whole other talk, all the different tributaries and thought that comes out of what is called the Theravada, the way of the elders. Okay, and then the Mahayana is called the Great Vehicle, which is everything else, basically. And they wrote their own suttas. They made up their own suttas, made their own discourse saying the Buddha was here and he said this and this and this. But everybody knows it's made up. But they still treat it, as the church, and they take various teachings from various other teachers and incorporate it into the canon itself.
Remind me what the second yana was?
The second yana is concentration. The second, yeah. Who's he?
I have like 4 questions.
No.
The 4 questions, honestly.
We're going to leave at 8:30. Okay, 5 more minutes or so.
So the first one, so this is all like incredibly highly structured.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if there's like numerology involved, but this many,
No
this
numerology.
8 of this, 20, 250 of
Yeah,
this.
for mnemonic purposes.
Okay.
And I didn't touch on others. Believe me, there's
Okay,
4
so
of
it's-
this, 10 of that, 8
It's
of this.
highly structured.
Exactly.
And how does that fit in to the concept of impermanence?
Because
It's
this
so highly structured.
because
but
if you
impermanence
follow
is not.
these structures, you will be able to attain the knowledge of impermanence. So if you understand the 4 noble truths, if you understand and practice the Eightfold Path, yes, they are. He says himself, these teachings are to be treated as a raft to cross the great river, the great ocean of samsara, which is delusion and wandering. So you use the teachings as a raft. Once you get to the other side, you don't carry it around on your head. You just throw it away, because now you're free. So it becomes only a vehicle and a tool.
Okay, next question. Did anyone else contribute to these teachings? And
Well, he
who
had...
transcribed all of this?
Well, that's what I was saying. Originally, it was Ananda and this convocation of 500 monks. And they sat down, they redacted, okay, this is the way this sutta goes. This is the way this discourse goes. This is... So they, at that point, 2,600 years ago, and then when the first, the Germans and the British, I mean, they only uncovered the British came to Sri Lanka in the early part of the 19th century, and they found these Buddhist monks already with what was called, they were writing, when they finally did write, they started writing on palm leaves with vegetable dyes, and then they started translating them, into English, into German, etc.
But they were all transcriptions of what he spoke, basically.
Well, this is what it's
I mean, that's what
assumed
it's-
for over 2,600 years.
Yeah.
You know how the game goes. It could be, but to me, I mean, if you read them, they're very cogent and they're very original. And there are some of them were, yes, there are some of the elder monks like Sariputta, Moggallana, a number of them who Ananda or the order decided we're going to keep these because they're really good discourses. But 99% of these are purportedly what the Buddha taught. And when you read them, you just cannot be. To me, the authenticity is there. Because there was nobody before him. The Jains were there, which we call the Jains. They propounded different, and they talk about the different sects that were, and their particular arguments and how the Buddha countered their arguments. So that brings an authenticity to it, that you read, well, this is what Mahavira said, and this is what this Brahmin said, and this is what the Buddha said to that. Well,
Like the Talmud.
it's not really like the Talmud. The Talmud is I think, more commentary on commentary. This is the original teaching. This is more the canon, like what Jesus spoke, or like Moses spoke, or like what Muhammad spoke. But it is not. There are obviously the Abhidhamma. There's different, which is this one, the higher teachings, which are sort of lists that are described in the discourses themselves that people have plotted out. We don't know who did those, but those came later. Definitely, it's understood the Abhidhamma, but they were incorporated because they're so exhaustive in their erudition that they were incorporated and they were made part of the canon. But that's known that, and the Vinaya is absolutely certain that these were the rules that the Buddha laid down.